Pain rarely knocks before entering a person's life. It comes suddenly, like a silent storm forming on the horizon we never noticed. When a crisis strikes, the first thing that rises in the mind is not a complete prayer, but a bewildered question. Why? If God is love, if He is all-powerful, if He truly cares about every tear that falls, then why does suffering still exist? That question is not new, yet whenever it touches our personal life, it feels as fierce as if it had never been asked before. Faith does not spare anyone from being wounded. Those who believe in God can still lose the ones they love. They can still fail. They can still fall into a darkness of the soul where no way out is visible. It is there that the inner struggle begins. On one side stands the faith that once upheld us. On the other stands a reality that makes us want to give up. Many have drifted away from faith not because they hated God, but because they could not reconcile the image of a loving God with the painfully real suffering in their own lives. The silence of heaven can hurt more than the event itself, and yet, in that very silence, a deeper journey begins to take shape. Not a journey toward quick answers, but a journey into the depth of mystery. Human beings were created with freedom, and freedom is a gift both noble and dangerous. No one can truly love without the ability to refuse. No one can choose what is good without the possibility of choosing evil. Love that is forced is no longer love. For this reason, within the very structure of creation, freedom stands as the condition that allows love to exist. But freedom also opens the door to mistakes, to betrayal, to violence and war. When humanity abuses freedom, suffering appears as a natural consequence. It is not God who created hatred. Human beings chose it. It is not God who sows war. The human heart has nurtured it, and then we turn and ask why He allows it. To allow is not to desire. To allow is not to agree. If God erased freedom every time we intended to do wrong, this world would become a stage where every character is controlled. Love would lose its meaning. The price of freedom is the possibility of hurting one another. The price of freedom is that tears can fall. Yet that same freedom makes it possible to love to the very end, to forgive to the very end, and to sacrifice to the very end. Without freedom, there would be no cross, and without the cross, there would be no resurrection. Not every suffering is a punishment. The idea that pain is the direct result of personal sin has wounded countless fragile souls. When someone is struck by a serious illness, what they need is not accusation. When a family loses a child, what they need is not rigid explanations about divine justice. Yet throughout religious history, people have often turned God into a judge waiting to punish. That image does not fully reflect the face of the gospel. There were times when Jesus Himself rejected the notion that suffering is the direct consequence of personal fault. He looked upon the sick not with condemnation, but with compassion. This opens another dimension of the mystery. Suffering can go beyond the simple logic of cause and effect that we are used to. Some events cannot be traced back to a specific sin. Some losses cannot be explained by a clear wrongdoing. When we rush to find someone to blame, we often deepen the wound. Faith does not force us to understand every cause. Faith invites us to trust that even when we do not understand, we are not abandoned. The uniqueness of Christianity does not lie in offering a flawless philosophical system to explain suffering. Its uniqueness lies in this: God does not stand outside human suffering. He does not observe from a distance. He does not send down a cold message. He enters history. He takes on flesh. He accepts betrayal, misunderstanding, scourging, and crucifixion. The cross is not merely a symbol of failure. It is proof that God did not exempt himself from what humanity must endure. When Jesus cried out in loneliness, that cry echoed every despair of humankind. No pain is too foreign to him. No tear is one he has not tasted. The question why does not disappear at the foot of the cross, but it is placed within a different context. Instead of a God indifferent to suffering, we see a God who suffers. That does not erase the pain, but it changes how we see it. We are no longer alone in the darkness. There is one who has gone before us through that very darkness. Reality shows that suffering can make a person bitter, but it can also make a person deeper. The same event can crush one person and mature another. The difference does not lie in the intensity of the pain, but in how the pain is received and transformed. When suffering is lived in loneliness and despair, it easily becomes a pit that swallows the soul. But when suffering is placed in relationship with God, it can become a place of purification, not because suffering in itself is good, but because in suffering, our illusions of control are stripped away, our fragile attachments are shaken. We are forced to face our limits. In that weakness, a new space opens for grace to work. The history of faith shows that many great souls grew precisely from their wounds. They did not seek suffering, they did not glorify pain, but they allowed suffering to become the material through which they loved more deeply, understood others more fully, and trusted when there was nothing left to hold on to. There are events whose hidden meaning we only recognize years later. When we are in the middle of the storm, our vision is limited. Everything seems chaotic and meaningless, yet time sometimes reveals connections we never saw before. A failure opens a new path. A loss leads to an unexpected encounter. A closed door keeps us from a greater danger we could not foresee. The belief that God can bring good out of evil is not an empty slogan. It is the conviction that his power is greater than evil. This does not turn evil into good, but it affirms that evil does not have the final word. Looking back on their lives, many realize that their darkest chapters were the places where they encountered God most deeply, not because they would wish to relive those days, but because in that very fragility, they learned how to surrender. Christian hope is not blind optimism. It does not deny the painful reality of the world. It looks directly at the cross and still believes in the resurrection. That hope rests on the promise that death is not the final chapter of history. If life ended in nothingness, suffering would indeed be utterly meaningless. But if there is a horizon beyond death, if there is a reality where every tear is wiped away, then present suffering is placed within a wider horizon. That does not make today's tears less bitter, but it prevents them from becoming eternal despair. Hope enables a person to rise even without having every answer. Hope does not explain the entire mystery. It gives us the strength to keep walking while the mystery remains. Many souls truly discover the depth of prayer only when they have nothing left to say. In favorable times, prayer flows easily. But when suffering lingers and the sky seems closed, prayer becomes dry. It is precisely in that dryness that faith is purified. We no longer seek God only for the consolations he gives. We seek him for who he is. Emotions may be absent. Emotional support may disappear. Yet the decision to remain, the decision to continue trusting even when we feel nothing, is a free and profound act. It is there that love matures. Love is no longer based on benefit, but on fidelity. Suffering, lived in this way, becomes a place where our relationship with God deepens. The modern world exalts control and efficiency. Every problem must have a quick solution. Every pain must be relieved immediately. In such a context, the mystery of suffering becomes hard to accept. People want simple answers. But faith does not always operate according to technical logic. Some realities cannot be fixed at once. Some wounds require time and grace. God's delay is not always indifference. Sometimes it is a way of educating the heart. We learn patience. We learn humility. We learn that we are not the center of the universe. These lessons are not easy, but they are necessary for inner growth. Suffering also has the power to widen the heart. Those who have endured loss often become more compassionate. Those who have been wounded often become more sensitive to the pain around them. When the heart breaks open, it can either close in on itself or open wider. Faith invites us to choose the second path, not by human effort alone, but through transforming grace. The cross is not only a symbol of endurance, it is also a symbol of self-giving. When pain is united with love, it is no longer a meaningless burden. It becomes a silent offering for others. In that dimension, suffering is transformed from within. No one seeks suffering for its own sake. It goes against our natural instinct. But when suffering comes, a choice still remains. We can allow it to define our entire identity, or we can let it become part of a greater story that God is writing. That story is not always clear. Many chapters seem disconnected and hard to understand, yet faith believes that the hand of providence is still at work. Even if we do not see the whole picture, each stroke is being placed exactly where it belongs. The darkest moment in many lives becomes the place where light is encountered in an unexpected way. When every support collapses, we realize we need a deeper foundation. When earthly securities fade, God's promise becomes more precious than ever. Not because circumstances change immediately, but because our inner vision is renewed. Suffering is no longer proof that God does not love. It can become the place where we discover that love in a depth we never knew before. Faith in a crucified God reshapes our understanding of power. His power is not always shown by instantly removing suffering. It is shown in the ability to transform suffering from within. The cross seemed to be the ultimate failure, yet it became the beginning of new life. This is the central paradox of Christian faith. It is not easily accepted by reason alone. It requires a leap of trust. But in that leap, we find a new freedom, no longer enslaved by fear. The journey of facing the question why does not end with a clear formula. Many questions remain open. Many tears continue to fall. Yet the presence of a God who walks with us changes the very nature of the journey. We do not walk alone. Even when we do not clearly feel it, faith whispers that there is one walking beside us. And sometimes what a person needs is not a complete explanation, but a hand holding theirs in the night. Darkness is not the final victor. Suffering is not the final word. Faith looks beyond the present, beyond the limits of what eyes see and ears hear. In that horizon, every suffering is placed within the light of an eternal promise. The promise that love is stronger than death. The promise that what we do not understand today will be revealed in a fuller reality. And in the midst of this demanding journey, a simple whisper still rises in the heart of the believer. Even when I do not understand everything, even when tears remain, I still believe. Night falls over the hospital room with a suffocating silence. The mother sits motionless beside the small bed where her child left this world only hours ago. Every sound seems drained away. Words of comfort become meaningless. The fluorescent light casts down on her pale face, and in those swollen, reddened eyes there are not only tears, but a question too deep to be spoken. She does not scream. She does not strike the walls. She does not blame anyone. There is only a vast emptiness opening inside her, a place where every prayer she once whispered seems to dissolve into nothing. If God is love, why did that love not hold on to a small, fragile life? In another part of the city, beneath lights that never go out, a young person sits quietly, staring at a phone screen. The last message is still there, but the one who sent it has left forever. Promises once spoken with sincere eyes have become a silent wound in the heart. The feeling of betrayal does not only shatter a relationship, it shakes trust in goodness itself. That love had been prayed for. It had been placed in God's hands. There was faith that He was guiding the way. And then everything collapsed without warning. In that moment, the question is no longer philosophical. It becomes a very real cry. Where are you, God, when my heart is breaking apart? In another corner of life, a believer still kneels faithfully every night. The familiar prayers are recited. Scripture is opened. A candle burns quietly in a small room, yet the test results do not change. The doctor speaks of worsening conditions. The medication no longer works as it once did. Faith remains, but deep inside, a weariness begins to grow, hard to name. I have prayed. I have hoped. Why is this illness still here? If God hears prayer, why does the silence last so long? These questions are not rebellion against heaven. They are the sighs of a wounded heart. The Bible has never hidden that reality. In the book of Job, a righteous man lost everything in a short span of time. His children died. His possessions were destroyed. His body was tormented by disease. Job did not remain silently resigned in a false way. He cried out from the ashes. He asked why he had been born only to suffer like this. My soul is weary of my life, he said. And Scripture did not erase that lament. It remains there as proof that true faith is not forbidden to question. The Psalms of lament echo with the same rhythm. O Lord, why do you stand far off? That prayer was not considered an offense. How long will you forget me? That cry was not removed from the sacred page. Those laments show that faith is not a layer of paint covering pain. Faith can tremble. Faith can weep. And sometimes faith is nothing more than a faint cry in a long night. When tragedy strikes, people long for clear explanations. Reason searches for causes, for order within chaos. But some events go beyond analysis. A child taken too soon cannot be explained by a simple formula of cause and effect. A betrayed heart cannot be soothed by a theological statement. A lingering illness does not disappear simply because enough prayers were recited. When suffering comes, the first thing needed is not a defense of God. It is presence beside the one who is falling. Many have heard answers that came too quickly. God has a plan. Everything happens for a reason. Just trust more. Those words may hold truth at some level, but when spoken at the wrong time, they become heavy burdens. The mother who just lost her child does not need a grand design drawn before her eyes. The young person who was betrayed does not need to hear that this is a necessary lesson. The sick do not need to be reminded to be stronger. They need someone brave enough to sit beside them and say, "This truly hurts." The question, why, is therefore not simply intellectual. It is a cry for compassion. It is a need to be heard in the darkness. When Job questioned God, he was not looking for a philosophical lecture. He wanted to know that his suffering was not meaningless. When the psalmist cried out in loneliness, he was not denying God's existence. He was expressing the absence he felt, and that honesty itself became prayer. True faith does not require us to pretend to be strong. It allows us to be weak before God. It allows us to say, "I do not understand. I am angry. I feel your silence." And in that naked honesty, a deeper relationship begins to form. not a relationship based on exchange, but one rooted in truthfulness. The darkness in each life takes different shapes, but the feeling of loneliness is strikingly similar. When every familiar support collapses, we begin to look toward heaven with different eyes. No longer the confident gaze of peaceful days, but the restless gaze of someone searching. If God is love, why does suffering exist? That question echoes in hospital rooms, in cramped apartments, in empty churches, in sleepless nights. Letting the question remain does not mean rejecting faith. Sometimes, refusing to rush toward an answer is itself an act of reverence for mystery. Human beings cannot reduce suffering to a few lines of explanation, and perhaps God does not want us to. Scripture does not offer a neat formula for this problem. It tells the stories of people who walked through darkness and still continued to call upon God's name. In the silence of heaven, we may not hear an explanation, but we can recognize something else. Our question does not fall into emptiness. It has been spoken before. It has been written on ancient pages. It has become the prayer of generations. That alone shows that the question has a place within the journey of faith. There is no need to rush to conclusions. There is no need to build a wall of arguments to protect God's image. In this moment, what matters is to remain with the pain, to remain with the mother who is weeping, to remain with the young person who is confused, to remain with the sick who are waiting for a miracle that has not yet come, to remain, and together look up at the silent sky. The question is still there. It has not been resolved. It has not been closed. But in the middle of the night, daring to ask and daring to weep before God is already a form of faith. And perhaps, before any answer is given, walking together in suffering is the place where God begins to speak in another way. From the very first pages of Scripture, the human being appears not as a pre-programmed machine, but as a being entrusted with choice. In the book of Genesis, the image of God creating humanity in His own image speaks not only of dignity, but of freedom. Human beings are placed in the garden. They are allowed to enjoy. They are allowed to cultivate. They are allowed to name the creatures. That act of naming is not a minor detail. It is a sign that humanity participates in creation with a distinct will of its own. Freedom is not an added accessory. It is a foundational structure of being human. Without freedom, we could not love, we could not create, we could not give ourselves away. But precisely because freedom exists, the possibility of refusal also appears. In the midst of a garden overflowing with life, the image of Adam and Eve standing before the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not merely an ancient story. It is a symbol of every choice in human life. God did not build an electric fence around that tree. He did not lock the human will. He gave a warning and then left space for a decision. That space is freedom. When Eve reached out and took the fruit, when Adam agreed to eat, what happened was not because God created evil, but because humanity used freedom in a way that separated itself from the source of life. Sin is not an object manufactured by God. It is the consequence of a choice that moves against love. Human history afterward seems like an extension of that first decision. War does not fall from the sky like a meteor. It is formed through human decisions driven by ambition and fear. Betrayal is not the product of a divine plan. It begins in a heart that places the self above loyalty. Violence is not sown by God's hand. It is the result of wills choosing to wound rather than to protect. When we look at the blood-stained pages of history, it is hard to say that everything was arranged by God. Many times, we arranged it for one another. If God removed freedom every time a person intended to do wrong, this world would become a stage where every action is remotely controlled. There would be no wars, but there would also be no voluntary sacrifice. There would be no betrayal, but there would also be no loyalty freely chosen. Love would become nothing more than a reflex, not a decision. A robot can be programmed to speak words of affection, but no one is moved by a sentence written in code. God is not seeking creatures who bow on command. He is seeking human beings who can say, "I love you," in freedom. For that reason, freedom always carries risk. When you give someone the power to choose, you accept the possibility of being rejected. When parents allow their children independence, they accept the possibility that they may fall. When God gave freedom to humanity, He accepted that love could be refused. That is not a sign of weakness in God. It is the depth of love. True love does not control. True love respects the other's choice, even when that choice leads to pain. Many ask why God did not create a world where everyone always chooses good. The question sounds reasonable, but it hides a contradiction. If everyone necessarily chose good, they would no longer truly choose at all. When there is no possibility of evil, goodness loses its moral weight. The nobility of courage exists only where cowardice is possible. The beauty of forgiveness has meaning only where revenge is an option. The very possibility of choosing wrongly makes the right choice valuable. Moral suffering is therefore deeply tied to freedom. The wounds caused by betrayal do not exist because God wanted someone to be hurt. They exist because someone chose personal interest over love. Broken families are not the result of God delighting in tears. They happen when promises are broken. Recognizing this does not make the pain disappear, but it places responsibility where it belongs. Not every evil originates from heaven. Often, it begins in very human decisions. The image of Adam and Eve hiding in the garden after eating the forbidden fruit reveals another consequence of misused freedom. Blame appears immediately. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the serpent. Human beings tend to shift responsibility outward, but the biblical story invites us to look inward. When we use freedom to wound others, the consequences do not stop with the single act. They create a chain reaction that spreads through relationships, through communities, even through generations. Yet freedom is not only the source of suffering, it is also the condition for the most beautiful realities in life. A soldier who risks his life to save a comrade does so not because he is forced, but because he chooses to. A person who forgives the one who hurt them does not do so because there is no other option, but because they decide to rise above revenge. Such acts can only exist in a world where freedom is real. The same gift can be misused, but it can also be lifted into holiness. God does not desire robots who love Him. The sentence sounds simple, but it carries deep theological meaning. A robot can obey perfectly, but it has no heart. A robot cannot doubt, and therefore cannot believe. Faith has meaning only where disbelief is possible. Love has value only where turning away is an option. When a person freely turns toward God, that choice carries real weight. It is not a reflex. It is a response. Risk, therefore, becomes part of the structure of love. No one enters a relationship without accepting the possibility of being hurt. No one loves deeply without accepting the risk of loss. God does the same. When He created humanity free, He accepted the possibility of being rejected, forgotten, opposed. The history of salvation shows humanity turning away from the one who gave it life. Yet freedom is never withdrawn. God's love continues to invite rather than to coerce. In this light, The question of moral suffering must be seen through responsibility, not to assign blame cruelly, but to acknowledge the human role in the tragedies of the world. When we ask God to end violence, we are also invited to examine the small forms of violence within our own way of living. When we long for a more just world, we must face the unjust choices we ourselves have made. Freedom is not only a right, it is a responsibility. This does not mean that every suffering is directly caused by an individual. There are unjust systems built up over generations. There are social structures that trap people in cycles of poverty and violence. Yet, even those systems began with concrete human choices in the past. Recognizing the role of freedom does not simplify the complexity, but it keeps us from seeing ourselves as nothing more than victims of fate. Freedom is a noble gift, but not a safe one. It gives us the capacity to rise to extraordinary love, and at the same time opens the possibility of causing profound harm. The presence of moral suffering in the world does not deny the love of God. It reveals how seriously He entrusts freedom to humanity. He respects our choices enough not to turn us into instruments. Amid all this complexity, one truth remains. Love is real only when it is chosen freely, and real freedom always carries real risk. That is the price of a world where human beings can love God and love one another, not because they are forced to, but because they truly desire to. There are words that sound deeply religious, yet they can cause someone's heart to shatter all over again. When a person is writhing in sickness or loss, the sentence, "Maybe God is punishing you," can fall like a cold blade. It not only increases the pain, it also carves a distorted image of God. The idea that every suffering is the direct result of a personal fault may seem logical, but real life shows that it is not that simple. Not every tragedy is a sentence written in heaven. The human mind naturally wants clear causes for everything that happens. When a child is born with a disability, when a kind person is struck by a sudden accident, many immediately ask what they did wrong. That question does not always come from malice. It often comes from a need for order. If suffering is punishment, then avoiding sin should mean avoiding pain. But reality shatters that fragile comfort. The upright can still face disaster. The selfish can still prosper for a long time. Life does not operate according to the simple formula we wish it did. In the Gospel according to St. John, chapter 9, there is the story of a man blind from birth. When the disciples saw him, they asked the familiar question of their time, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" That question reflected a common belief that suffering is always tied to personal sin. But the answer of Jesus Christ broke that framework. He said it was not that this man sinned, nor his parents. That declaration did more than clear one blind man's name. It lifted a burden from countless souls who had been wrongly condemned. The answer of Jesus did not deny the reality of sin in the world. Sin is real, and it carries consequences. But he showed that we cannot assign every specific suffering to a specific act. The man's blindness was not a personal sentence. It became a place where the glory of God was revealed. Through healing, the vision of Jesus rises above the simple logic of reward and punishment. He sees the person before he sees a theory about causes. Many people walk away from faith because they were taught that the tragedies of their lives are proof of moral failure. A woman struggling with infertility hears someone whisper that she must lack faith. A man battling depression is told he has not prayed enough. A family struck by calamity is subtly accused of hidden wrongdoing. Those words, whether careless or deliberate, turn God into a harsh judge, always looking for someone to punish. But the gospel does not paint that face. Jesus did not approach the blind man to interrogate him about his past. He did not demand that he prove his innocence. Before being healed, he bent down, he touched the dust, and he opened a new horizon before him. That gesture tells us that mercy comes before analysis. Presence comes before explanation. In many cases, what the suffering person truly needs is not a record of sins, but a hand that lifts them up. This does not mean that all suffering is completely separated from personal responsibility. Some wrong choices do lead to real consequences, but the complexity of life does not allow us to reduce every tragedy to a direct punishment. There are sufferings that go beyond human understanding. There are events that cannot be decoded by simple cause and effect. When we try to force them into the narrow frame of reward and punishment, we only diminish the mystery. The existence of innocent suffering challenges every closed system of thought. It forces us to admit that there are dark places our reason cannot fully illuminate. The blind man in the gospel did not receive a detailed explanation for his condition. What he received was light, and that light opened not only his physical eyes, but also a new awareness of God. When suffering is labeled as punishment, the one who suffers carries an added burden. They battle not only illness or loss, but also guilt. They ask themselves where they went wrong, what they lacked. That feeling can suffocate hope. The gospel frees the human heart from those chains by reminding us that not every pain is a personal punishment. There is a difference between moral responsibility and mystery. Moral responsibility can be examined and corrected. Mystery requires humility. When we stand before tragedies we cannot explain, the right response is not accusation, but reverent silence. Faith does not require that we have every answer. It invites us to trust, even when the questions remain. Looking again at the story of the blind man, what leaves a deep impression is not only the miracle itself, but the way Jesus redefined the issue. He shifted the focus from searching for sin to revealing love. That vision changes how we face the suffering of others. Instead of asking what they did wrong, we can ask how to stand beside them. Instead of searching for faults, we can seek to bring light. When religious communities forget this, they risk becoming places of judgment rather than places of healing. Accusations are easily made. Assumptions are built without evidence. The suffering person feels as if standing in a courtroom instead of being embraced, and they leave carrying with them the image of a cold God. That does not reflect the gospel. Suffering is not always punishment. That statement does not deny the reality of justice, but it opens space for mercy and for mystery. It reminds us that not every tear is the result of a verdict. Some tears are part of a greater story, where the meaning has not yet been fully revealed. Faith matures when it accepts that some things are beyond understanding. Not every question is answered the way we expect. Yet even in that unknowing, we can still trust that God is not one who seeks to punish every small mistake. He is the one who enters history to save, not to crush. In a world filled with quick judgments, the words of Jesus still echo like a declaration of freedom. It was not this man who sinned, nor his parents. Those words still carry power today. They invite us to let go of simplistic thinking and to learn how to stand with those who suffer, not to defend God at any cost, but to reflect the merciful face that the gospel has revealed. In the midst of unanswered questions about suffering, Christianity does not begin with a tightly constructed system of arguments, but with a shocking image: God crucified. The center of this faith is not a philosophical explanation of evil, but a body torn apart on a wooden cross. When human beings demand a logical answer, God gives himself. That answer is not written on paper. It is written in blood and water flowing from his pierced side. Many religious traditions speak of a supreme being who stands above all suffering, but in Christianity, that one does not remain a distant observer. According to the Gospel of St. Matthew, Jesus stepped into the darkest hours of human life. He did not avoid loneliness. He did not escape betrayal. He did not turn away from death. Suffering was not merely a topic he taught about. It became a reality he tasted. The night in the Garden of Olives is one of the most honest moments. There, Jesus Christ does not appear as a fearless hero. He trembles. He is sorrowful, even to death. His sweat falls to the ground like drops of blood. The prayer, "Let this cup pass from me," reveals that he truly felt the terror of suffering. No divine shield covered that emotion. God chose to step into the fragility of human existence. Then, on Golgotha, as darkness covered the land, a cry tore through the sky: "My Father, why have you forsaken me?" That cry is recorded in the Gospel, not to shock, but to reveal the depth of companionship. It is not the lament of someone unfamiliar with suffering, but the cry of the Son of God himself. He did not spare himself. The feeling of abandonment, he went to the very end of human experience. When people ask why God does not stop all suffering, Christianity does not present a chart of causes and effects. Instead, it points to the cross. There, God does not defend himself with arguments, but with self-giving love. The answer is not, "This has a reason." The answer is, "I am here with you." That presence does not immediately erase pain, but it transforms the way we understand loneliness. What makes the difference is not that suffering disappears, but that God enters into it. If he had remained outside, simply explaining, the distance between heaven and earth would still remain. But when he accepted humiliation, scourging, and being lifted up between heaven and earth, that distance was broken. The cross became a bridge between God and every cry of humanity. The image of Jesus crucified reveals a paradox. Power shown through weakness. God did not prove his love by removing all suffering from his own life, but by carrying it. He did not stand above, watching humanity struggle. He stood at the very center of the storm. That changes entirely how divine power is understood. Many expect a God who intervenes forcefully to extinguish injustice at once. But the cross shows another way, the way of self-giving. God did not choose violence to answer violence. He allowed himself to be wounded. In that silence, another kind of strength was revealed, the strength of love, willing to sacrifice. The cry, "Why have you forsaken me?" also touches the experience of those who have felt abandoned. When a person believes that God is silent, they can remember that Jesus himself uttered that question. That does not mean he lost faith. It means he carried even the feeling of distance that human beings endure. God is not unfamiliar with moments when faith trembles. In the light of the cross, suffering is no longer a place where God is absent. It becomes a place he has already passed through. Every human tear meets a drop of blood that has been shed. Every sigh can find an echo in the final breath on the cross. That companionship is not an abstract idea. It is a historical event told through the Gospels. The center of Christian theology does not revolve around the question why, in a philosophical sense, but around the question who. Who is present in suffering? The answer is God incarnate. When believers look at the cross, they do not see pain alone. They see a God who chooses to remain. That brings a different kind of hope, a hope born from solidarity. What happened at Golgotha does not make suffering pleasant, but it prevents it from being utterly meaningless. If God has entered the darkness, then darkness is no longer a place completely untouched by light. The resurrection, though it comes after, does not erase the memory of the cross. It proclaims that love is stronger than death, yet it does not deny that death truly happened. God did not exempt himself from what human beings endure. He did not keep a safe distance. He accepted betrayal by a close friend. He endured an unjust trial. He was condemned, though innocent. Those experiences mirror many forms of suffering today. So, when someone feels crushed by life, they can look up and know that God is not a stranger to that feeling. The cross also rejects the idea that God cares only about glory. He did not avoid what was ugly and cruel. He allowed himself to enter its very center. This overturns completely the way people imagine the divine. Power is no longer defined by the ability to escape suffering, but by the ability to love to the very end. Within suffering, when faced with the question of evil, Christianity does not offer an explanation that satisfies the mind in every detail. Instead, it points to a crucified man and says that there, God has revealed himself. He does not stand outside the tragedy of humanity. He steps into it, carries it, and transforms it into a place of encounter. In that light, suffering is no longer where God is absent, but where he has walked and where he remains with us. No one in their right mind goes looking for suffering as if it were a reward. Wounds do not suddenly become beautiful just because we give them a religious meaning. Christianity does not encourage the worship of pain, nor does it urge people to endure in silence, as though suffering were noble in itself. And yet, Scripture opens another dimension. Suffering, when received in relationship with God, can become a place of purification and fruitfulness. This does not make tears less salty, but it keeps them from falling in vain. St. Paul once spoke of a thorn in the flesh that he pleaded many times to have removed. In his letters, especially in the letter to the Corinthians, he admits that weakness as a real burden. No one knows exactly whether it was an illness, a temptation, or some other specific trial. What matters is that the answer he received was not immediate deliverance, but the assurance that grace was sufficient for him. The weakness was not erased, but it became the place where God's power was revealed. In Romans chapter 5, Paul writes that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces proven character, and character produces hope. This chain is not a slogan that tries to put a positive spin on pain. It reflects the lived experience of a man who endured persecution, imprisonment, and discovered that trials can mature the human heart. Perseverance here is not passive resignation. It is the strength to remain standing in the storm without losing faith. The purification Scripture speaks of is not the denial of emotion. Pain still hurts. Loss still leaves an empty space. But when a person does not run from God, in the midst of trial, something deep within begins to change. Self-sufficiency is worn down. The illusion of total control fades away. The heart becomes softer toward the suffering of others. These fruits do not appear overnight. They grow quietly. The difference between meaningless suffering and suffering united with God does not lie in how heavy the circumstances are, but in the direction of the heart. Meaningless suffering traps a person in bitterness and despair, where everything becomes a closed circle of darkness. But when suffering is placed in relationship with God, it no longer devours itself. It opens another dimension where a person can whisper, "I am not alone." This does not mean that every suffering automatically becomes fruitful. If applied superficially, the idea that suffering bears fruit can become a spiritual burden. A wounded person may feel pressured to prove that they are growing because of their pain, but true fruit does not come from force. It grows from a quiet union with the one who walked the way of the cross. When suffering is united with him, it is slowly transformed from within. St. Paul did not boast in suffering itself, but in the discovery that in weakness he was closer to God. The thorn did not disappear, but it kept him from pride. It reminded him that his achievements did not come from his own strength. Instead of destroying him, that trial became the place where he learned to trust more deeply. Purification does not diminish human dignity, it refines it. Perseverance, in the biblical sense, is the ability to keep walking even when the destination is not yet visible. Suffering forces a person to confront their limits, and within those limits, hope is purified of illusion. Hope is no longer a dream that everything will be easy. It becomes the conviction that even in darkness, God is still at work. Such hope is not fragile. It has been tempered by fire. Meaningless suffering often closes a person in on themselves. It makes them withdraw, distrust everything, even love. But suffering united with God can widen the heart. Someone who has passed through brokenness may become a refuge for others. Someone who has endured illness may understand another patient's fear. The fruit is not always great achievements. Sometimes it is a deeper compassion. What matters is that pain must not be romanticized, as though it were the only path to growth. God does not need suffering in order to love. Yet in a world where suffering is an undeniable reality, He can transform it into an opportunity for change. That transformation does not erase the memory of wounds, but it prevents the wounds from becoming a person's only identity. When someone looks back on a life marked by trials and realizes they have grown deeper, it does not mean they would choose to repeat that pain. It simply means that darkness did not win. Fruit is sometimes recognized only after many years. In the present moment, all one may see is dry soil. But Scripture invites us to trust that the seed is quietly sprouting. Union with God in suffering is not a technical act. It is a living relationship. It means daring to bring one's pain before Him instead of sealing it away in isolation. When a person does this, suffering is no longer entirely a private burden. It is placed within a greater story where love has the final word. St. Paul did not deny that he had begged for relief. He was honest about his desire to be freed from the weight. This shows that seeking healing does not contradict faith, but when the answer was to remain in the trial, he learned to see it in a new light. The thorn was no longer merely a nuisance. It became a bridge, leading him into deeper dependence on grace. Suffering, when separated from God, can push a person into the abyss of meaninglessness. When united with Him, it remains suffering, but it is no longer empty. The difference is not always visible from the outside. It unfolds within, where the choice to trust is made each day. Not every wound blossoms at once, but in the light of faith, they can become soil for something new. In the end, the greatest fruit is not success or recognition, but a purified heart. A heart that knows humility, that knows compassion, that knows how to hope in the midst of adversity. Christianity does not paint suffering in soft colors, but it insists that suffering does not have the right to determine the final meaning of a human life. When united with God, even the broken fragments can become material for a deeper story of redemption. In the desert of betrayal and tears, the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis unfolds like a slow symphony of providence. Not loud, not hurried, each event follows another like quiet waves pressing against the life of a young man. Joseph was not only misunderstood, he was rejected by his own brothers. From a son deeply loved by his father, he was thrown into a pit, then sold like merchandise. The desert sand may still have clung to his hands as the caravan carried him far away. The eyes of his brothers, when they decided to sell him, were surely not entirely without feeling. There was jealousy there, anger, a deep irritation at dreams that seemed too large. But in that moment, evil was chosen. None of them were thinking of a plan of salvation. They simply wanted to remove someone who troubled them. Evil often begins just like that, from a heart that has not been purified. The road to Egypt was not only a geographical journey, but a descent to the bottom. Joseph moved from freedom into slavery. He served in another man's house, living by his master's command. And just as he began to earn a measure of trust, another false accusation pushed him into prison. That chain of events could have led anyone to conclude that God had abandoned him. The darkness was not only outside the prison bars, it crept into the soul. The years passed in the silence of a cell. There was no clear sign that anything would change. The dreams of his youth must have been questioned again and again. Was it all an illusion? Had evil truly won? That question did not belong to Joseph alone. It belongs to everyone who has ever been betrayed and forgotten. And yet, beneath the quiet current of history, something unseen was being woven. Joseph's ability to interpret dreams opened a door. From prison, he was brought before Pharaoh. From a prisoner, he became the steward of food for all Egypt. This rise was not a dazzling miracle in a single night, but the fruit of a long journey where every wound was used for a greater purpose. When famine spread across the land, the very brothers who had once sold him came to Egypt seeking grain. That reunion was not only dramatic, but heavy with emotions long buried. Joseph had the right to take revenge. He had the right to let them taste abandonment. But instead of choosing that path, he looked beyond their actions and saw something deeper at work. Joseph's words rise like a theological summit. "You intended to harm me, but God turned it into good. Those words do not deny that their actions were evil, they name the wrong for what it was. Yet at the same time, they declare that evil does not have the final word. God did not create the betrayal, but he did not allow it to destroy his purpose. Here, a clear distinction must be made. God is not the author of sin. The jealousy and the decision to sell Joseph were human choices, freely made. But in his providence, he is able to draw good even from shattered pieces. This does not make the wrong act good. It simply reveals that the power of salvation is greater than the power of sin. Joseph's story does not turn suffering into something pleasant. He was truly wounded. The years of being sold, accused, and imprisoned cannot be erased from memory. Yet when he looked back, he could trace a red thread running through it all. Without the pit, without the caravan, without the prison, he would not have stood in the place where he could save many from famine. Evil was not denied, but it was placed beneath a greater plan. There is a quiet beauty in the way God worked through Joseph's history. He did not stop every wrongful act, but he wove them into a story that would save a nation. This offers a fragile yet profound hope to those who stand in the middle of hardship. Today, they may see only the pit. They may not yet see the palace ahead, but the story is not over. Evil often tries to persuade the human heart that it is the final chapter. It whispers that betrayal will remain an open wound forever. But Joseph's words reveal another vision. When he looked at his brothers, he no longer saw only those who had harmed him, but men who had unknowingly become part of a greater plan. His forgiveness was not forgetfulness. It was placing the past under a new light. No evil is stronger than God's plan of salvation. This affirmation is not naive optimism. It was born from a history marked by upheaval. If the betrayal of brothers could be transformed into a means of saving many lives, then no circumstance is entirely excluded from the possibility of transformation. This does not guarantee that every story will end in the same way, but it opens a horizon of hope. Joseph's story also invites patience with one's own journey. While he sat in prison, he could not see the throne in his future. Providence is not always revealed at once. Often, only years later do we recognize that events which once seemed meaningless were shaping us. Good may be taking form in silence. In a world where evil can seem painfully obvious, this story reminds us that God is not powerless. He does not need to create darkness to accomplish his will, yet he is powerful enough to transform darkness into a place where light can break through. This does not erase suffering, but it keeps despair from claiming the whole heart. When we read again the journey of Joseph in the book of Genesis, we see more than a complicated family story. We hear a quiet confession: evil is not the final destiny. God can draw good from evil. And in the slow unfolding of history, he continues to write new chapters from pages that once seemed torn beyond repair. Not every story closes with light visible to the eye. Some pages of life end in a hospital room, at a graveside, in an empty house after a farewell. If we look only through the limited lens of the present, it is easy to think that suffering is the final period. But the depth of Christian faith always whispers something else. This is not the last chapter. What we see now is not the whole manuscript. Among the promises scattered throughout Scripture, the book of Revelation paints a daring vision. God will wipe away every tear, and death shall be no more. That image is not a moral lecture. It is a symbolic portrait of the future. Tears, the common language of humanity, are not dismissed. they are acknowledged, touched, and God Himself bends down to wipe them dry. Eschatological hope is not an escape from reality. It does not tell us to deny today's pain. On the contrary, it allows us to face suffering without being swallowed by it. When we know that death does not have the final word, we can walk through a cemetery with real sorrow, yet not with absolute despair. The ending has not been fully written here. In that light, death is no longer an unbreakable wall, but a doorway into another reality. This does not lessen the pain of separation. Those who remain still weep, still remember, still feel the emptiness. But faith whispers that love is not buried with the body. If God is the living one, then those who belong to Him do not vanish into nothingness. Revelation speaks of a new heaven and a new earth, where justice and peace embrace. These images may stretch beyond imagination, yet they carry a clear message. History is not drifting toward meaningless chaos. It is moving toward fulfillment. Suffering, therefore, is not an eternal destiny. It belongs to a stage of the journey, not to its destination. In a fractured reality, that hope can seem fragile. To believe in a future where tears are wiped away requires courage, yet it is precisely this fragility that makes hope pure. It does not rest on visible proof, but on the promise of a faithful God. And that promise has been sealed through the history of salvation. Suffering often causes us to fold inward, trapped within the present moment. It narrows our vision until only immediate pain remains. Eschatological hope widens that horizon. It reminds us that each human life is placed within a greater story. What seems meaningless today may one day be illuminated by another light. This is not cheap comfort. It does not say that everything will be fine right now. It says that everything will be brought to completion in a way the present cannot yet comprehend. There is a difference between denying suffering and placing it within a larger vision. Faith chooses the second path. When we reflect on that vision, we may imagine a world where injustice no longer prevails, where the cry of a child no longer rises because of war, where illness no longer ravages the body. These images are not mere fantasy. They are a confession that God did not create humanity for destruction, but for fullness of life. In that light, death is stripped of its ultimate power. It remains a fearful enemy, but it is not the victor. Christianity dares to affirm that there is a life stronger than death. This belief does not make funerals less painful, but it kindles a small flame in the night. That flame may tremble, but it does not go out. Eschatological hope also transforms the way we live now. When we know that history is moving toward a just fulfillment, we can persevere in doing good even when we see no results. We can love in a cold world, trusting that love is never wasted. No act of love disappears into nothingness. There are long nights when questions still hang in the air and answers do not come. In those nights, hope is not a shout of triumph, but a whisper. It is not loud, not dramatic. It is just enough to keep the heart from collapsing. And sometimes, that is enough to take one more step into another day. The final image is not a cheering crowd, but a solitary figure kneeling in the dark. No applause, no full explanation of every mystery. The night still surrounds, the questions still remain. Yet in the silence, that person folds their hands and lifts their head. Lips trembling, not because everything has been understood, but because they choose to believe even without seeing. The prayer is not long, not ornate, only a simple sentence, "I still believe." In those words, the whole spirit of still I trust, is gathered, not because suffering has vanished, but because hope is stronger than fear. And so the story does not close in darkness. It pauses at an act of trust. Suffering is not the final chapter, because the final chapter belongs to a God who wipes away tears and gives life. Until that day, in the unfinished pages of our lives, we can still whisper into the night, I still believe.